I remember the drizzle first, a thin, needling fall that clung to my coat as if determined to remind me of the hour I had tried to ignore. Oxford often looks most honest in the rain, its stones releasing a tired scent of age and unresolved quarrels, and I found myself drifting without real purpose toward St. Isidore's. The chapel door had been left ajar, a faint thread of music escaping into the quadrangle like an invitation I had no desire to refuse. I stepped inside with that familiar, reluctant curiosity, the kind that precedes trouble more often than truth. The choir was rehearsing something gentle, the sort of piece whose beauty comes from restraint rather than ambition. Boys' voices rose and slipped away, leaving a residue of air that felt too fragile to disturb. I stood near the back, listening, letting the day's irritation soften around the edges. One of the candles near the rood screen guttered, pulling my attention to a row of stalls worn smooth by centuries of restless hands. I've always had a fondness for old wood, not because of its beauty, but because it remembers far more than it reveals. A boy near the front, thin and pale in the strange way choir boys often are, whispered to another that someone had found a letter tucked beneath one of the seats. A trivial remark, easily dismissed, yet something about the way he said the letter carried a tremor of unease. I've learned to trust the smallest vibrations. They often point to the deeper fault lines. Lewis would later tell me I read too much into children's mutterings, but he wasn't there to hear the pause that followed the boys' words, nor the subtle exchange of glances between the older choristers. They sang with renewed force then, as if to mask the quiet disturbance that had passed between them. I stayed through the final cadences, waiting for the sound to resolve itself into something orderly, but it never quite did. After the rehearsal, I lingered, staring at the brass memorial plates fixed to the chapel floor. Latin inscriptions, the occasional forgotten surname, years that felt like half-remembered sighs. The kind of place where the line between devotion and secrecy blurs, and one can imagine all manner of confessions being swallowed by the stones. It was while I was studying one such inscription that the organist brushed past me, muttering that the boys had been distracted all evening. His irritation was real, but beneath it I sensed something more brittle worry, perhaps, or guilt dressed as professional dissatisfaction. He moved away without another word, and I drifted toward the northern row of stalls. The drizzle still pattered faintly against the stained glass windows, soft enough to seem like breath rather than weather. I slid a hand along the third stall and felt a roughness beneath the polished grain. Not quite a splinter, more like a crease on paper. I bent down and glimpsed the corner of something pale tucked tightly against the inner panel. Letter, crushed flat as though pressed there with deliberate care. I didn't remove it. Not then. It wasn't my case, not yet, and I've learned that premature understanding can be as misleading as ignorance. Still, I felt the familiar stirring, that unwelcome but undeniable recognition that something had been placed in my path. A breadcrumb for a man who, despite better judgment, rarely turns away from such trails. The candle near the screen sputtered again. A tiny sound, barely significant, yet it dissolved the moment before it could solidify. I left the letter where it was and stepped back into the aisle. My shoes echoed faintly against the stone, a lonely rhythm that matched the unsettled thought tapping at the back of my mind. Outside, the drizzle had thickened, softening the edges of the quad. I stood for a moment beneath the archway, letting the cold settle into my coat. Oxford always offers two versions of itself. The visible one, with its spires and scholarly pretensions, and the other, the one I've spent a lifetime navigating the world of unspoken grievances, half-heard confessions, and carefully buried truths. The kind of truths that sometimes hide in choir stalls, folded into paper and pressed beneath wood. I walked away from St. Isidore's without any intention of returning. Yet even as I crossed the damp cobbles, I knew that intention would not hold. Mysteries do not begin with bodies or blood, at least not for me. They begin with small disturbances, a whispered remark, a misplaced letter, a feeling that someone, somewhere, has done something they wish desperately to forget. And that night, in the hush after rehearsal, I felt the first quiet pull of such a thing. A minor key, unresolved, waiting for me to listen more closely. Lewis brought me the letter the next morning, though morning is too generous a word for the greying hour when the city holds its breath before deciding whether to wake. He arrived with that mixture of mild irritation and dutiful concern he reserves for occasions he suspects I'm taking too seriously. He placed the folded sheet on my table beside the cold remains of last night's whiskey, and I could see from the faint tightening of his jaw that he had already read it. He said it was found exactly where I had noticed it, pressed so firmly against the wood that a thin crease mirrored the grain. He tried to sound indifferent, but something in the letter had unsettled even him. I unfolded the page with more care than was necessary. The paper felt strangely warm, as if it retained the echo of a hand that lingered too long before releasing it. The handwriting was beautiful in the way danger sometimes is precise, deliberate, and painfully aware of its own elegance. It spoke of a young choral scholar who had died some years earlier, though died was not the word the writer chose. The letter claimed he had been helped on his way during Compline, a phrase that clung to me like dampness. It suggested gentleness and violence in equal measure, a contradiction I've come to associate with secrets born in cloisters and echoing chambers. Lewis made a remark about students telling stories to fill long evenings, but I barely heard him. My eyes kept drifting back to one line in particular, where the writer insisted that the college's version of events was comfortable fiction. Comfortable, an oddly domestic word to use in the context of death. And fiction suggested performance, narrative. Someone at St. Isidore's had rewritten the end of a life, smoothing its edges to fit neatly inside the margins of respectability. I told Lewis we needed to speak with the bursar, though I didn't bother offering him a reason. He followed me, muttering that the day promised nothing but cold floors and worse coffee, which was likely true. When we reached the college, the quad was still slick from the night's drizzle. I noticed the way water clung to the carved stone faces above the hall windows, making them appear as though they wept. I've seen such illusions before, but this one lingered with an insistence that made me uncomfortable. The bursar greeted us with the thin cordiality of a man who knows cooperation costs more than it earns. His office smelled of dust and dying ambition. I asked about the scholar's death, threading my questions through pauses rather than force. He answered quickly at the first accident, tragic, unavoidable. But when I mentioned the letter, his gaze flickered to a stack of ledgers on the corner of his desk. The movement was slight, easily dismissed, yet it told me more than his entire account. People reveal guilt not by what they admit, but by where their eyes go when truth brushes against them. He insisted the scholar had been troubled, prone to melancholy, perhaps leaning too heavily toward the dramatic. A fall from the organ loft was unfortunate, but not suspicious. His words flowed with professional finality, but the cadence wavered when he mentioned the memorial service, as if memory scratched at something he preferred, kept buried. I noted the tremor, storing it in that quiet part of my mind where incomplete thoughts gather until they begin to make sense. When we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis asked whether I believed the letter. I told him I believed it had nothing to do with it. The phrasing was too controlled, the timing too precise. Someone had waited years before deciding the truth deserved to breathe. People rarely delay confession unless the cost of speaking is higher than the weight of silence. As we left St. Isidore's, I slipped the letter into my coat pocket. It felt heavier there, not physically, but in the way certain objects become burdens the moment they are entrusted to you. The quad was empty, the air cool and faintly metallic, as though the city braced itself for a revelation it would rather avoid. Lewis walked beside me, his steps steady, mine uneven with a thought I couldn't yet articulate. It was only later, alone in my rooms, that I noticed a tiny detail I'd overlooked in the morning light, a faint indentation at the bottom of the letter, as if someone had pressed the page hard against a surface while writing in haste. The shape suggested a pattern, perhaps the edge of a book or a frame. A small thing, easily ignored, yet it stirred the same unease I'd felt in the chapel. Clues rarely arrive in grandeur. They appear instead in quiet accusations, a crease in paper, a shift in tone, a word too carefully chosen, and once they appear, they rarely let you go. I returned to St. Isidore's that afternoon with the uneasy sense that I was stepping into a story someone else had rehearsed long before I arrived. The rain had given way to a dry, brittle cold that sharpened every sound in the quad. A cough from an unseen student, the thud of a bicycle against worn stone, the lonely sweep of a porter's broom. Oxford can feel strangely hollow on such days, as though its centuries are holding their breath. St. Isidore's felt more so, a college carrying an old bruise just beneath the surface. The chapel looked different in daylight, less forgiving, its arches more severe. I passed it without stopping, though my steps faltered near the door. It's curious how a place begins to acquire significance after a single disturbance. I continued on, making my way toward the choir school and the administrative wing behind it. The corridors smelled of chalk and the faint, pleasant decay of hymnals long thumbed by careful hands. Each floorboard offered a soft complaint as I walked, the kind that tells you a building knows its own age far too well. I had arranged to speak with the choir master first. He greeted me with the wary courtesy of a man accustomed to defending himself, even when no accusation has been made. His office was crowded with manuscripts and old rehearsal notes, stacked in perilous towers that suggested a mind both meticulous and disordered. He spoke of the dead scholar, the one mentioned in the letter, as though discussing a former pupil who had disappointed him by dying too soon. "Troubled lad," he murmured. "Brilliant in patches but unpredictable. The kind of mind that startles you one moment and vanishes the next." Yet there was an odd lilt in his voice when he said unpredictable, a softness, almost fondness. I wondered whether it concealed regret or something closer to envy. His gaze drifted toward a stack of bound scores, and for a moment I saw his jaw clench. I've learned to watch for such fleeting gestures. They often reveal what words refuse to. From the choir master, I went to the dean, a man who wore his importance like an ill-fitted robe. His office smelled of polished wood and muted authority. He welcomed me with a smile that vanished the moment I mentioned the scholar's death. He reminded me politely, firmly, that the matter had been resolved years ago. A tragic fall, the college mourned. Appropriate rites were observed. The end. But the tremor in his hands as he adjusted a paperweight told a different story. People often betray themselves when touching objects connected to their sense of order. It wasn't until I spoke with the visiting academic, a specialist in medieval hymns, that the shape of something older began to surface. She was one of those quietly intense individuals who carry a private world of thoughts behind their eyes. She said the scholar had been researching the origin of a particular chant, something obscure and apparently unremarkable, but he believed it held a coded message related to a dispute in the college's past. When I asked what dispute, she smiled faintly, as if amused by my ignorance, and said that every college has quarrels sealed beneath its stones. St. Isidore's simply buries theirs more carefully. I left her office with more questions than answers, which is often a sign that one is heading in the correct direction. Lewis joined me then, carrying 2 cups of dreadful machine coffee. He asked whether I had learned anything useful. I told him that usefulness was a matter of perspective. I had learned that 4 people remembered the same dead scholar in 4 different ways. That kind of inconsistency rarely blooms without a root. We walked toward the library, a place that always calms me even when it shouldn't. The smell of old paper can be comforting or accusatory, depending on what one carries in the mind. The librarian greeted us with a slight bow and nervous hands. Her eyes flicked toward a shelf behind her, then quickly away. I followed the motion, wondering what book she feared I might notice. She said the scholar had spent long hours in the reading room, often late into the night, poring over documents few students even knew existed. When she hesitated, I asked whether he had ever borrowed anything unusual. She said nothing at first, then admitted he once requested access to the restricted archives. I asked what for. She answered with a whisper that barely crossed the desk, something about a missing diary page. She looked away immediately, the way someone does when speaking truth that might be overheard by the past. I thanked her and stepped out into the dim corridor, the air cooler there and strangely expectant. Lewis asked if the librarian seemed frightened. I told him she seemed burdened. There's a difference, though sometimes the two coexist so tightly that you can't separate them until it's too late. As we left the building, a gust of wind scraped dry leaves across the stone, making a thin, rasping sound. It reminded me of pages turning, though no human hand was near. I thought of the scholar, of the coded chant, of the missing diary page, and of the letter pressed into the choir stall like a plea that had waited too long. Trouble rarely announces itself loudly at St. Isidore's. It whispers, it lingers, it hides behind hymnals and half-forgotten grievances. And on that cold afternoon I felt the first clear stirring of something that had been waiting, patient and unresolved, for years. I often think that suspicion begins not with evidence, but with the tone of the small hesitations people tuck between their sentences, the silences that last a breath too long. St. Isidore's was full of such pauses that week, each of them carrying the faint echo of something left unsaid. I returned, knowing I would need to speak with the people who had known the dead scholar best, or at least claimed to. It is remarkable how quickly truth frays when passed between intelligent minds with something to lose. The choir master greeted me again with a resigned tolerance that bordered on irritation. His office felt different this time, as though the air had thickened with the unease of my return. He spoke of the scholar with a stilted affection, describing him as gifted in ways that troubled more than they impressed. He said the boy had a temperament that rose and fell with the music he studied, and that he feared for him long before the fall from the loft. His words were carefully spaced, arranged with the precision of a man constructing a defense even before he has been accused. When I asked whether there had been quarrels, he shrugged in a way that suggested both denial and awareness. I noticed the tip of his left finger tapping rhythmically on the edge of the piano, a small gesture that betrayed an agitation he hadn't confessed. From him, Lewis and I moved to the graduate student who had once assisted the scholar with archival work. She spoke with an academic's mixture of pride and detachment, insisting that the scholar had been on the brink of discovering something extraordinary. When pressed, she claimed it involved an old ledger and a dispute she couldn't quite articulate. She said the scholar had confided in her once, late at night in the reading room, that he had found a pattern that shouldn't exist. She offered the information with a calm that felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced her concern until it had become convincing. Lewis asked whether she believed the scholar had enemies. She leaned back, fingers brushing the spine of a book behind her, and said that scholars seldom require enemies, only rivals. She smiled, but it was a brittle sort of smile, one that didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes. I made a note of that expression. People underestimate how revealing stillness can be. The librarian was next, her nerves more apparent than before. She told us that the scholar had borrowed a volume on ecclesiastical disputes shortly before his death. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her cardigan, the motion small but incessant, as though she were trying to suppress a tremor of memory. When I asked whether she knew about the missing diary page, she hesitated for a full second too long. She finally said she had no knowledge of it, but the refusal was too careful, too perfectly shaped to be natural. Lewis shot me a look that said he, too, had noticed the pause. Pauses in conversation are like rests in music. They matter as much as the notes. A final conversation took place with the dean's niece, the one rumored to have been close to the scholar. She was poised, articulate, and carried herself with the weary dignity of someone accustomed to whispers. She denied any impropriety, though she admitted the scholar had been troubled in the weeks before his death. There was a sadness in her voice that didn't feel performed. When she spoke his name, she softened in a way none of the others had. Yet even she faltered when I asked about the night of the fall. Her gaze drifted toward the chapel window, not with fear, but with longing, as if she were searching for something she could no longer retrieve. As Lewis and I crossed the quad, he observed that every person we had spoken with seemed to be guarding a different version of the scholar. I told him that was precisely what troubled me. People do not fracture a memory unless they are trying to keep part of it from view. He said we had no proof of anything yet. I reminded him that proof is often the last thing to appear. What matters first is the shape of unease. Back in my room, I spread the notes across the table. The pages formed no coherent pattern, yet they hummed with a faint dissonance, each account tuned a half step away from the next. That disparity carried a particular quality, one I'd felt before in cases where truth had been rewritten quietly by too many hands. While reviewing my notes, I noticed a small annotation I had scribbled earlier and forgotten a reference to a crossword clue the scholar had been fond of discussing, something about harmony hiding a deeper line beneath. I had dismissed it at the time, but now it stirred faintly with new implication. The night settled around me, the room dim but oddly companionable. I sat listening to the distant bells echoing across the city, thinking of how easily human lives fall out of tune. St. Isidore's was full of intelligent people with intelligent reasons to lie, each of them striking a different note, none of them quite true. What mattered now was finding the single thread of melody beneath the noise, and I felt, for the first time, that it was beginning to reveal itself quietly, stubbornly, and in a minor key. The packet arrived on a morning so colorless it felt scraped clean of intention, the kind of Oxford hour when the sky seems undecided about its own existence. I found it on my doorstep, sealed with an unremarkable strip of tape, the sort of thing delivered by someone who didn't wish to linger. There was no handwriting, no name, only a faint pressure mark along one edge, as though whoever carried it had held it too tightly. I lifted it with the gentle suspicion I usually reserve for objects that know more than they mean to. Inside were 3 items: a photocopy of a will, an old photograph, and a single crossword clue torn from a newspaper. The back will bore the scholar's name. The photograph showed a choir from some past year, the faces young and earnest, the corners curled by time, and the clue, cantus firmus, concealed beneath harmony in print that had smudged enough to suggest someone had folded and unfolded it repeatedly. I sat with the packet on my lap, feeling the uneasy weight of someone else's conscience. Lewis arrived a little later, carrying the same expression he wears when he senses I've drifted too far into thought. He asked whether the packet alarmed me. I told him alarm was too strong a word. Curiosity had sharper teeth. He looked at the will first. Nothing unusual at a glance. A few modest bequests, a mention of research notes, and a curious absence of anything that tied the scholar to his family. Lewis asked whether scholars often cut ties so completely. I said scholars often walk away from the living when they believe the dead are more accommodating. He didn't laugh, though he might have wanted to. The photograph held my attention longer. Something about the arrangement of the choir felt off. Not the posture or the clothing that followed the expected conventions, but the order of the boys. They stood not by height or age, but by something else. Something I couldn't decipher immediately. My eyes rested on the scholar's face, a solemn expression slightly out of alignment with the others, as though he had been thinking of something beyond the moment the photograph tried to preserve. I traced the faint shadow beneath his chin, the kind produced by a hesitant tilt of the head. A small gesture, but revealing. There is always meaning in where people direct their gaze, even within the stillness of a photograph. Lewis shifted uncomfortably when I mentioned this. He asked whether I saw ghosts in everything. I told him you don't need ghosts when the living do such an admirable job of haunting themselves. He said I was being morbid, which may have been true, though truth rarely bothers me when I'm already circling around it. We turned our attention to the crossword clue. Cantus firmus concealed beneath harmony. A clue only makes sense if it is both obvious and hidden, a contradiction I've always found oddly comforting. A cantus firmus is a steady line, the underlying thread upon which all else is built. The scholar must have found something beneath the surface of his research, a fixed truth disguised by the more elaborate melodies around it. I wondered whether the packet had been sent by someone who wished me to follow that thread, or by someone who feared I would. Later that afternoon, I sought out the archivist again. Her office was dim, the air smelling of vellum and old arguments. I placed the photograph before her and asked whether she recognized the arrangement of the boys. She studied it for longer than necessary, her fingers brushing the edges as though the image still radiated warmth. She said the choir had been reorganized that year due to an internal matter she could not discuss. Her voice held the crispness of someone reciting a line written for them by someone else. I thanked her and left, though not before noticing the way her eyes lingered on the scholar's face. Not with affection, with regret. The stillness of the quad pressed against me as I stepped outside, the afternoon light thin and uncertain. I walked without direction, letting my thoughts fall into that quiet rhythm where intuition and memory meet. The packet felt heavier in my coat, as though gathering substance from the cold. It was only back in my rooms, long after the light had drained from the windows, that a small detail finally stirred. The pressure mark on the packet. I recognized its shape now, the slight indentation left by a ring, the kind worn by someone who signs documents daily, someone with authority and a long habit of pressing their seal a little too firmly. A small thing, a quiet thing, but it belonged to St. Isidore's. And silence, I've found, is often the loudest confession of all. It was late afternoon when I returned to the library, the hour when the winter light flattens the world into a pale insistence and every sound seems to travel further than it should. St. Isidore's had settled into one of its habitual silences, a silence made not of peace but of anticipation, as though the buildings themselves were waiting for someone to admit something they had long concealed. I walked the length of the reading room slowly, feeling the faint tremor in the wooden floorboards, each creak a reminder of footsteps that had passed before mine. The librarian looked up the moment she heard me, and I saw something collapse just behind her eyes. People break quietly. They rarely choose noise. I told her we needed to speak somewhere less exposed. She nodded with an obedience that felt new, as if resistance had finally exhausted her, and she led me to a cramped office behind the music archives. The air inside smelled of parchment and a thin thread of lavender, perhaps a last attempt at keeping the room from absorbing too many confessions. She folded her hands before speaking, the gesture careful enough to betray her nerves. She said she had not meant for the scholar to be hurt. I did not press her. People unravel at their own pace, not at the investigator's convenience. She spoke of the scholar as though recalling a melody she had tried repeatedly to forget. He had been kind, she said, and too curious for his own safety. He spent nights in the archives, poring over documents others had dismissed as irrelevant, convinced that the college's past held a contradiction that could destroy reputations. The way she said the contradiction struck me not as a challenge to the truth, but as a betrayal of it. I asked what sort of documents he had been studying. She hesitated, and her hesitation was a confession in itself. Finally, she opened a drawer and withdrew a page so thin it seemed on the verge of tearing. The missing diary page. She placed it before me with the trembling care one reserves for delicate, dangerous things. I read it slowly. The handwriting was hurried, the lines uneven, as though the scholar had written it in fear or urgency. He mentioned hearing a voice above the choir loft, not singing but murmuring, a footstep not meant to be there, a shadow that moved when the rest of the chapel lay still. The page ended abruptly, mid-thought, mid-breath, as though the writer had been interrupted. Lewis leaned against the door frame, and I could sense his discomfort thickening the air. He asked why she hadn't given us the page earlier. She looked at him with a sadness that felt older than she was. She said she had been ashamed, not of the scholar's death, but of what she had done to protect someone who no longer deserved protecting. She didn't name the person, but names are unnecessary when guilt is already pointing in a clear direction. I told her she had carried the burden long enough. She shook her head gently, saying burdens are rarely transferable. They grow roots. She then spoke of the scholar's final weeks, how he had become certain that someone was following him, how he avoided the upper floors of the library unless absolutely necessary, how he once arrived at her door, pale and breathless, insisting he had found something in the college's finances, a misalignment, an erasure, a truth concealed beneath years of polished tradition. His words had frightened her, she admitted, not because she doubted him, but because she believed him entirely. When she finished speaking, the room felt unbearably small. I asked her one final question, why she had preserved the diary page rather than destroy it. She stared at the window for a long moment before answering. She said some truths resist being silenced. They pressed themselves into memory the way a watermark clings to paper. She whispered that she had hoped someone would eventually come looking, someone who saw the world the way the scholar had, painfully, attentively, without comfort. I thanked her and stepped into the corridor, where the cold felt sharper, as though the college exhaled a breath it had been holding. Lewis walked beside me, his steps heavier than usual. He said the librarian seemed fragile. I told him fragility and courage are often made of the same thin glass. He said we were still no closer to understanding who had been in the rafters that night. I reminded him that understanding rarely arrives in straight lines. It bends. It delays. It hides until the moment it decides to be seen. As we left the building, I felt a shift in the case, not a revelation, not even clarity, but a faint tightening of threads that had previously drifted. The diary page weighed against my coat like a pulse. A soft wind rose across the quad, carrying with it the faintest trace of choir practice beginning in the chapel. Voices rising, voices falling, and beneath them, something steadier, something waiting. Perhaps the scholar had heard it first. Perhaps I was beginning to hear it too. It is a strange thing, the way a case sometimes offers you a solution that arrives looking perfectly formed, polished even, as though it has been waiting for you to notice it. And strangers still show the mind, weary from chasing scattered hints, almost welcoming the illusion. That evening, after leaving the archivist's corridor and the lingering thread of her guilt, I found myself entertaining an answer that fit too neatly. Answers that arrive dressed for acceptance are rarely the ones worth trusting, but fatigue has a way of softening the instinct. Lewis and I walked back toward the chapel, the light thinning around us until the stones took on a bruised color. He said something about the choir master, how his irritability, his evasions, his strangely sharpened emotions pointed toward a man who had far more to hide than artistic frustration. It was easy to imagine him climbing the narrow stairway to the loft, driven by jealousy or rage or something more pathetic, the bitterness of talent that had soured with age. Easy to picture his hand reaching out in the dimness, a shove disguised as an accident. Easy to think the scholar's fall had been the tragic, inevitable end to a rivalry that had spiraled out of control. The trouble with easy pictures, I told Lewis, is that they blur the edges the moment you stare too closely. Still, I allowed myself to test the idea. I imagined the choir master confronted by the scholar in the chapel, their voices rising in the carved shadows. The scholar's discovery of financial irregularities, or whatever else he had unearthed, might have threatened more than reputations. Perhaps he had confided too carelessly. Perhaps the choir master had overheard something not meant for him. A mind already strained by professional decline might find fear and envy indistinguishable. The pieces slid into place with deceptive grace. Lewis mentioned the librarian's tremor again, her unsteady refusal to name anyone in particular. He said, "Fear makes liars of everyone." I reminded him that guilt makes liars too, but their lies are quieter, more painstakingly assembled. He asked what I meant. I didn't answer. Some thoughts lose their shape when voiced too early. We reached the chapel as the final trace of light dissolved behind the spires. Inside, the air felt cooler, though the candles near the sanctuary flickered with an almost theatrical steadiness. We climbed the narrow stairway leading to the loft. The wood groaned beneath us, the same groan that must have echoed beneath the scholar's final ascent. The loft, when reached, felt smaller than memory had shaped it, a cramped platform of worn boards and old dust. I could picture the choir master standing there, breath-sharp with anger. It was convincing, too convincing. Lewis noted a smudge of polish on the railing, as though someone had gripped it recently. He looked at me, waiting for the pronouncement that would turn suspicion into accusation. I traced the smudge with my fingertip. It told me nothing. Or rather, it told me too much. Anyone, choir boy, caretaker, chorister, might have brushed against it in the course of a day. A clue that points everywhere, points nowhere at all. When we descended, I found myself thinking of the scholar's diary page, those final lines describing a voice in the rafters and a footstep not meant to be there. The choir master's heavy tread would not be mistaken for a whisper of movement. Nor would he have hidden himself among the beams. His presence was too conspicuous, his temperament too brittle. The idea of him stalking the scholar through the dimness began to unravel even as it took shape. We spoke next with the graduate student who had been practicing alone in one of the rehearsal rooms. Her expression shifted when she saw us, not with fear, but calculation. She asked whether we had found what we wanted in the loft. I said we had found possibilities. She smiled, thin and sharp. "Possibilities are treacherous things, Inspector," she murmured. "They tempt you toward the wrong people." Her tone had an edge of triumph, as though she wished to guide my suspicion without appearing to do so. It was in that moment, the glint in her eyes, the tout-clever phrasing, that the neat accusation against the choir master collapsed like a poorly built cord. She wanted me to suspect him. Someone else wanted the blame to drift subtly in his direction. Someone had let the story form just enough shape to seem credible before dissolving upon scrutiny. A manufactured truth as fragile as breath on glass. Later, back in my room, I looked at the will, the photograph, the torn crossword clue. They lay before me like notes from a melody I hadn't yet learned to hear. Cantus firmus, concealed beneath harmony. Beneath harmony. I repeated the phrase until its weight settled. The real line, the real truth, was always underneath the surface arrangement. The choir master had been in harmony. A loud one, admittedly, but not the line that held the music together, not the line worth following. And as the room thickened with the stillness of late evening, I realized the case had offered me its second red herring. Polished, plausible, even satisfying. But wrong. The real dissonance waited elsewhere, quiet and persistent, like a single note refusing to be drowned. Night had crept over Oxford, with a kind of steady, inevitable weight that makes every alley and archway seem older than it is. I felt the cold more sharply that evening, as though the air itself had thinned around the edges of the college. Lewis asked whether I truly meant to return to the chapel at such an hour. I told him darkness sometimes loosens the threads. Daylight keeps too tightly knotted. He sighed in the way he does when he knows argument is useless, and followed me across the quad, our footsteps muted by the damp stone. The chapel doors opened with a reluctant groan, the hinges complaining like old scholars roused from sleep. Inside, the silence was full, layered, almost watchful. I stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Candlelight flickered near the altar, throwing thin shadows against the choir stalls. The air carried the faint scent of extinguished incense, with that trace of cold stone that reminds you how many lives have passed unnoticed between those walls. I told Lewis I needed to go up alone. He didn't like it, but he remained in the nave, his restless shifting echoing faintly. I took the narrow stairway slowly. The wood felt unforgiving under my hands, each step releasing the smallest creak of a private conversation between the building and its memory of footsteps. Halfway up, I paused. Not because I was tired, but because I heard something. A soft sound, indistinct, the kind that could be mistaken for imagination if one wanted to be comforted. But I was past the point of seeking comfort. The loft greeted me with its familiar austerity beams worn to a muted sheen, dust settling in shallow drifts, darkness pressed tightly between the rafters. I walked to the railing and looked down into the chapel. Lewis was a small silhouette against the dim glow. I called his name softly. He answered, but the way his voice bent and stretched in the vaulted air caught me off guard. The sound recoiled strangely, coming back to me elongated, distorted. It was the kind of echo that disguised its own origin. I tried again, listening more closely this time. The acoustics didn't simply return the sound. They carried it differently along the beams, as though the rafters themselves altered the voice. I recalled the scholar's diary page, the line about hearing a voice above, not singing, but murmuring, as though the chapel itself tried to speak. I realized that someone could have stood in those rafters, nearly invisible, their voice traveling where their presence could not. A faint scuff caught my attention, and a mark on one of the higher beams. I climbed the small ladder that led to the upper platform, feeling the brittle wood shift beneath me. The platform was narrow, barely more than an improvised ledge from some long-forgotten renovation. Yet there were signs of recent use. A small crescent of wax, a shallow indentation in the dust, and there, near the far edge, a boot mark faint but wrong. Too broad to belong to the scholar, too sharply angled to match a hurried misstep. I traced the outline with my thumb, feeling the grain of the wood beneath. Someone had been here. Recently. Someone who knew the chapel well enough to use its acoustics as cover. Someone who could watch without being seen, listen without being suspected. My mind drifted briefly to the dean, the way his gaze had flinched when I mentioned the scholar's death, the tremor in his hands brushing against the paperweight. Guilt rarely announces itself loudly. It shifts in small betrayals of posture. Lewis called up to me then, his voice sounding oddly distant despite his closeness. I told him to wait. I needed another moment. The rafters seemed to tighten around me, holding the air in a way that made every breath feel deliberate. I thought of the choir librarian's confession, the scholar's fear, the coded clue about a cantus firmus concealed beneath harmony. The truth, whatever it was, hid beneath the obvious arrangements like this platform, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. I noticed another detail, a faint line on the wall where dust had been brushed aside in the shape of a square, as though a box or a folder had once rested there. Recently removed, likely carried by someone with authority to enter the chapel unnoticed. Someone who believed the rafters offered more safety than the college archives. When I descended at last, Lewis asked whether I had found anything. I told him nothing definite, which was true, though not complete. The rafters held too much implication to describe yet. He looked uneasy as we left, glancing back once as though expecting a figure to appear in the gloom above. Outside, the cold struck hard. I wrapped my coat tighter, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. A voice in the rafters. A shadow that moved where none should. A platform that had not been empty. The scholar had heard something he should not have heard, and someone had heard him hearing it. As we crossed the quad, I felt a quiet certainty that the college's oldest silence had begun to crack. Whatever truth had hidden itself in the beams was no longer content to stay buried. And neither, I suspected, was I. I've often found that the truth does not arrive with trumpets, nor even with certainty, but with a quiet settling in the mind, a rearrangement of small fragments until they form a shape one can finally bear to look at. That night, long after Lewis had retired with the weary practicality that always made me feel older than I was, I sat alone in my rooms, the rafters of the chapel still echoing in my thoughts. Outside, a thin rain scratched at the window, as though urging me toward a conclusion I had resisted for days. The scholar's diary page lay beside the photograph, both of them pale in the lamplight. I read the final lines once more. The voice above, the footsteps where there should have been none. I tried to imagine his last moments, not sentimentally, but with the cold clarity the past demanded. He had climbed the loft that night, perhaps to confirm the pattern he believed he had found, perhaps to hide a document, perhaps to confront its implications alone. What he heard up there had frightened him, enough that he tried to record it even as fear gathered around him. The cantus firmus clue whispered through my memory, its metaphor finally aligning with something steadier. Beneath harmony, beneath arrangement, beneath performance. There had been a steady line through the case from the beginning, one I had tried to hear beneath the competing voices of suspects, eager to distract or exonerate themselves. I spread out the will again. The altered bequest, the oddly absent family, the signature that trembled in places where a young man's hand should not have trembled. Lewis had dismissed it earlier, but the indentation on the packet, the mark of a ring, returned to me now with a sharper insistence. Someone accustomed to signing documents in an office bathed in academic authority. Someone whose decisions were accepted without question. I thought of the dean then, of the way his eyes cooled when I mentioned the scholar's death, of the silence that had stretched too long before he spoke. A silence not of grief, but calculation. And that tremor, the tiny betrayal of a hand that had once pushed too hard against something that should not have been touched at all. Still, I resisted the idea. The dean was a man of rigid propriety, the sort who spent his life threading the needle between dignity and decorum. Yet I have learned that such men break not with loud violence, but with the quiet panic that comes when their careful order is threatened. A scholar who discovered irregularities in the college's finances would be a threat indeed, especially if he stumbled upon something older, something shameful, something capable of dismantling a reputation built across decades. The photograph drew my eye again. The scholar's posture, the way he tilted just slightly apart from the others, as though he already sensed that he existed on the fragile edge of something others preferred not to see. Behind him stood the dean in a younger, more confident incarnation, his smile too symmetrical, too controlled. I traced the faint outline around the dean's hand of a ring, heavy, ornamental, the same shape as the indentation on the packet. A possibility, sharp and unwelcome, settled inside me. The dean had followed the scholar to the chapel that night, confronted him perhaps in the narrowness of the loft. A whispered argument, a hurried denial, a hand reaching out, not for violence, but for restraint, panic grafting itself onto fear, a push, a fall that echoed through the chapel like a broken chord. I closed my eyes. The scene played itself out quietly, almost gently as tragedies sometimes do. The dean, shaken, descending the staircase with the scholar's final breath still caught in the rafters. The librarian, loyal to the wrong man, removed the diary page in misguided protection. The photograph sent by someone whose remorse had grown heavier than caution. the packet sealed by a hand that once signed academic decrees with effortless confidence. Lewis returned then, his steps muffled in the corridor. He asked whether I had reached any conclusions. I told him conclusions were too heavy a word, but patterns had begun to merge. He asked whether the answer was close. I said the answer had been closed for days. I'd simply been listening to the wrong harmony. He frowned, not understanding, but accepting the uncertainty with the patience I'd always admired in him. When he left again, the rain intensified, and the truth, or something like it, pressed closer around me. The scholar had died not from malice, but from fear, meeting desperation, and the college, with all its hymns and history, had tried to bury the dissonance beneath a more comfortable chord. The past never truly buries itself, I murmured into the quiet. It waits in rafters. It waits on paper. It waits in the spaces between footsteps. And now, at last, it was ready to be heard. I returned to St. Isidore's the following evening with a heaviness I could not attribute solely to the case. There are moments in this job, rare, unwelcome, when understanding arrives not as triumph, but as a slow forfeiture of hope. The chapel stood ahead of me, lit from within by a thin spill of candlelight that seemed uncertain of its purpose. Choir practice was already underway. The voices drifted into the quad with a clarity that felt almost accusatory. Music has a way of sounding truer when the truth itself is unraveling. Lewis walked beside me in that steady, dependable silence of his. He asked whether I intended to confront the dean that night. I told him confrontation was a generous word. I merely meant to speak plainly to a man who had avoided plainness for far too long. He muttered something about caution, but it dissolved in the cold before it reached me. The dean was waiting near the choir vestry, his gown hanging from his shoulders like a burden he no longer had the strength to carry. He greeted us with the brittle politeness of someone who has exhausted all his reserves of denial. I watched the tremor in his fingers when he clasped them together. Not dramatic, not even noticeable unless one had spent a lifetime searching for fractures in apparently solid men. I told him quietly that I had visited the loft again, that I had stood where the scholar had stood, that I had listened to the chapel bell sound in unnatural ways. His eyes shuttered at the smallest flicker of a man realizing his private nightmare was finally stepping into daylight. He said nothing, but the silence between us became too shaped, too deliberate to be anything but confession. Lewis waited behind me, broad-shouldered and calm, a kind of silent mercy in his presence. I told the dean what I believed, that he had gone to the chapel that night to stop the scholar from revealing the financial irregularities, that he had climbed the narrow stairs in desperation rather than cruelty, that in the dark, with fear tightening every breath, he had reached out, meaning to restrain, perhaps to reason, and the scholar had slipped. The dean pressed his hand against his mouth as though trying to keep the memory from escaping. He murmured that the scholar had been frightened not of the discovery itself, but of the weight of what it implied. The college's long, careful facade, the stability of men who'd built their lives on appearances. He said he had only meant to steady him, that the fall had been sudden, soundless, except for the final sickening strike of bone on stone. He said he had knelt beside the boy, unable to breathe, unable to pray. I believed him, or rather, I believed the tragedy of him, the quiet, shattering remorse that clung to every movement he made. I've known murderers who kill with calculation, and men who kill with a panic so fragile it barely resembles intent. The dean belonged to the latter, a man broken by his own misjudgment long before we arrived at his door. We walked him out through the side corridor, a place where the walls absorbed sorrow more willingly. Lewis did the practical work, the quiet instructions, the firm steadiness of procedure. I remained a few steps back. There is a loneliness in witnessing a life bend under the weight of its own consequence. I felt it pressing against me then, not sympathy, not pity, but the solemn ache that comes from recognizing the helplessness of it all. When he was taken away, I stayed in the quad. The choir's voices rose and fell from the chapel with a strange, fractured purity. One voice was missing, of course the one that would never return, the one that had carried its own harmony and dissonance into those rafters. And yet the music continued. It always does. Human absence rarely stops the world, no matter how desperately we imagine it should. Lewis joined me after a while, hands deep in his pockets. He said justice was a hard word for nights like this. I told him justice was merely the word we use when truth feels too cold, too impersonal. He said he hoped the scholar had found peace. I said peace was a luxury the living rarely understand. We stood in silence for a time, listening to the last notes dissolving into the vaulted air. There was something haunting in the sound, not sorrow, not resolution, but a kind of suspended breath. A choir without harmony, a life interrupted, a man undone by a single moment of fear. Eventually, the candles were extinguished one by one, and the chapel settled back into its ancient stillness. I turned away first, knowing the case was over in the official sense, but would linger in the private corridors of memory for longer than I cared to admit. Some truths, once heard, never fully fade. They echo faintly, insistently, like a voice in the rafters that refuses to be silenced.